Proverbs 5 and the forbidden woman. So let's start just by reading through the chapter, and then I'll talk a little bit about the first part, and then we will move on and get all of your thoughts. My son, listen to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding, so as to watch over discretion, and your lips guard knowledge. For the lips of a strange woman drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil. So I didn't realize I'm reading this in the scriptures 2009, which isn't bad, but I prefer to read it in the ESV because I'm just a little more familiar. But in the end, she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps follow the path to Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways wander, and she does not know it. And now, O sons, listen to me, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house, lest you give her your honor to others, and your years to the merciless. Lest strangers take their fill of your strength, and your labors go to the house of a foreigner. And at the end of your life you groan, when your flesh and body are consumed, and you say, how I hated discipline, and my heart despised reproof. I did not listen to the voice of my teachers, or incline my ear to my instructors. I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? Let them be for yourself alone, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman, and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? For a man's ways are before the eyes of Yahweh, and he ponders all his paths. The iniquities of the wicked ensnare him, and he is held fast in the cords of his sin. He dies for lack of discipline, and because of his great folly, he is led astray. All right, the forbidden woman, it talks about the strange woman, which is actually, it doesn't mean strange as in weird or, unknown. It means the woman who is not yours, talking about a married man. This woman is some other man's wife. In verses 5 through 6, it says that her feet go down to death. Her steps follow the path to Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways wander, and she does not know it. Her feet go down to death, and she doesn't even know it. Now, the immediate context, this is talking about marriage and an adulteress. But this same principle applies much more broadly. There are always people out there who are, giving you ear-tickling doctrines, telling you what you want to hear, or telling you what they know will provoke a certain response in you. Not necessarily because it's true, but because there is some kind of reaction they want. And whether the reaction is donations, or they want you to join a movement, or something that they want from you. The problem is that I don't think that most of these false teachers and false prophets even know that they are false prophets and false teachers. Most of them really believe that they are doing the right thing. If you think about Korah's rebellion against Moses, Korah had just witnessed the destruction of Egypt and the Egyptian army. He had seen the sea divided and God's presence on the mountain. And yet here he is challenging God's chosen man for the priest. And he's saying, we're all holy. Why can't we all be priests? Well, the answer is because God said so. God's got his plan. Korah doubted the word of Moses and Aaron about God's plan, despite all the evidence that showed that Moses and Aaron were the men that God had chosen. And he and his entire family and everybody associated with him paid dearly for it. They lost their lives. And they didn't even know that they were false teachers. There is no way that Korah would have gone up against Moses and Aaron, having seen all of these miracles from God, if he believed that he was in the wrong and he was making himself an enemy of God. And the problem with people like Korah and Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron who kind of colored outside the lines with worship and God destroyed them. The problem is that they followed their own inclinations about what they believed to be right and wrong. and they got other people to follow along with them. They died, and the people who followed them died. When the solution, the thing that kept them all alive, was right there in front of them the whole time, but it was outside of themselves. The world wants to tell us, if you want to know what's right, look inside yourself. If you've been praying and studying the word for, decades, that's going to be helpful. Looking inside will frequently get you to the right place. It'll point you in the right direction, but not always. Our hearts will always be corrupted. Until we're resurrected in perfected bodies, we're always going to be struggling against the flesh. We're always going to have poor judgment at times. And so we need an external objective source to measure right and wrong. And unless we are able to find that source outside of ourselves, we're always going to be susceptible to falling into these traps. And moving on from there, these are the 4 sections that I thought Proverbs 5 most easily divided into. Certainly inside of these different sections, there are subsections, individual sentences and thoughts, specific qualities of the woman or qualities of the man who follows her. And all of these things have profound connections to the rest of Scripture, and even outside of the immediate context of the strange or forbidden woman. So I'd like to ask if anybody has any specific thoughts on verses 1 through 6. Anybody get a chance to spend some time on that?
I did notice that it goes downhill pretty fast. I mean, It's literally 5-3 is, the carrot, and 4 through 6 are the stick. I mean, it's like there's very little positive other than that. Once you become her slave, I guess, because it talks later about what happens. It essentially, you become a slave to this woman. It's just nothing but destruction.
Yeah, we're definitely a slave to your own bad decisions, because she's making just as bad a decision or worse is what you are. I mean, not you, of course. You know what I mean. Solomon couches most of his advice as father to son, but most of this advice applies just as well to his daughters. There are some things that are specific, of course, to how a male is attracted to a female, but the principles are the same, no matter which perspective you're coming from. There are men who are also out there, maybe even more so, who are trying to seduce women, people into whatever scheme they've got going on, using flattery and persuasion to make you think that whatever it is that they're proposing is a good idea. I mean, this happens with all kinds of people.
And Jay, I know that just to let you know, the ISR in verse 7 actually says, "So now listen to me, you children," which I like that because it makes it like everyone, not just the sons, but it says you children. But could you also look at this as the strange woman, as the whore of Babylon? Come out of her, my people, and the deception of like replacement theology and all that.
Definitely an adulterous system.
Right.
If you look at us as God's bride, there is this system out there that wants to lure us away into this adulterous relationship with foreign gods or foreign ideologies. Right. And it fits very, very neatly into that same picture.
I found one that says that another word for strange is hostile. So it could be like people are hostile to his word. And it says oil coming off her lips is smooth, and we know by crushings and discipline we get the good oil. Would that be like the easy way, the easy road? The wide road, the eye of the needle?
Yeah, it certainly could be. That's probably one of the main things that outside of the context of adultery, or maybe even in the context of adultery, one of the main attractions is how easy something is. Something I've told my son, I don't know how many times over the years, that nothing worth having is easy. If it's something that's of real value, it's going to take work. And it doesn't always take work to get it, but it takes work to maintain it. Somewhere along the line, it's going to get hard. Our salvation is free. There's nothing we can do to earn it, but it's still hard. Yeshua demands everything from us in return. And maintaining that relationship is very difficult over time. And if it's easy, then you've probably gone astray somewhere. And people who want to make it easy, whether it's, easy financial gain, easy relationship, easy salvation, what they call greasy grace, they're the strange woman too. They may not even know that they are, but they are leading people astray. And in this, her feet go down to death. Her steps follow the path to Sheol. Those people do too.
I was going to say, along with the, I guess the possible connection to the Whore of Babylon, is I see what appears to me to be a pretty strong similarity with verses 3 and 4, where in Revelation 10:10 says, I took the little scroll from the angel's hand and ate it, and it tasted as sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach turned sour. And some of the translations use the word bitter as well. Mm-hmm. But there's just several similar terms there, and it just kind of got me thinking about when and that was specifically spoken to many peoples, nations, and tongues and kings. And so when we think about that, that Babylon system, Mystery Babylon, and all of that together, that when it comes to the judgments of God, I think that there is very much a similarity between what's happening when a man chooses, to follow after the whore, mm-hmm. that it is sweet, but then it just turns bitter. And so anyway, just something that really popped out to me.
And isn't the first mention of wormwood in the Torah, isn't that talking about the man that thinks his wife has committed adultery, goes before the priest?
Oh, the Sota trial.
She drinks the curse's water. Is that where wormwood is first mentioned?
I don't think so.
But it's in the Torah somewhere.
Yeah, it could be. I'm not sure. In the case of the Sota, the woman drinks a mixture of sanctified water and dust from the tabernacle floor and ink from the parchment that the curses were written on. So the curses are written on the parchment. The water is mixed with the dust from the tabernacle floor and poured over the parchment to wash off the words. And then she drinks it. Now, I don't know what the ink is made of. So there could be something there, but I don't think the text mentions wormwood. Those are some interesting connections, though. I'm not exactly sure what to make of it.
Oh, the forbidden thing doesn't mm-hmm. start out as bitter, or it wouldn't be a temptation.
Right.
The whole point of a temptation is that there's something about it which is appealing to you that would cause you to compromise in order to attain it. And I mean, just that alone is such this whole, first part talking about, if you're looking at it just as a simple temptation, the forbidden thing mm-hmm. is enticing, but this is where it will lead you. And that's why it is forbidden. I thought it was interesting in the verse 2, keep discretion, your lips may guard knowledge. We have so many words. There's so many words in the world that we live in. Everybody has a blog. Everybody's got a comment, a tweet, so many words. Mm-hmm. But that it's, that your mouth, that's where you guard your knowledge. That's where you keep that discretion where you guard yourself. And I think often I'll own that, talk myself into permissiveness in ways that is, I don't know, that's just that I can talk myself into it, or that I can allow myself that words can be that thing for me.
I got stuck on verses 1 and 2 as well, because I was thinking of, so be attentive to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding, keep discretion in your and your lips may guard knowledge. So wisdom, understanding, and knowledge are 3 different things. And we get knowledge from hearing information, right? And so we obtain knowledge, and our understanding comes from our experiences, our observations, and additional knowledge that we add to that. And all of that together hopefully results in wisdom if we're wise. And so when I think about, again, just like Heidi was saying with verse 2, that you may keep discretion and your lips may guard knowledge. So he's saying, attentive to my wisdom, because I've had the experience. I know a lot more than you do. I've been on this earth a lot longer than you have. I've seen a lot more, and I have understanding based on my life experiences. And so from that has come my wisdom. So pay attention and keep discretion. And just like Heidi was saying, with all of social media and all of the opportunities for us to express our opinions, most of the time we should probably just keep our mouths shut and allow our understanding to belong to us, allow our knowledge to be protected, so that we don't let that temptress get a hold of us and say something that is so sweet and slippery that we fall into that lie. Because, and I think it's pretty pretty clear to me, at least, why the analogy is a temptress, an adulteress, is that sexual sin is one of the hardest sins to break away from once you compromise yourself to be involved. And so once you're in it, it is so difficult to break away. It's probably one of the spiritual issues that are dealt with most in church counseling is sexual sin. And so allowing our mouths to get us into a situation where we are now compromising our understanding of the things that we've learned in life and the wisdom that has come from that, we start to lose the wisdom and we become the same as the foolish.
Yeah, and that is especially easy online and social media. I mean, I am constantly typing out long paragraphs of comments and then just deleting it all.
Yeah.
And I still manage to post all kinds of crap that I know that I will regret at some point.
Yeah, well, later on in the chapter, it talks about how you've destroyed everything that you built. You allow yourself to fall into this trap because your reputation is gone. People think you've lost your mind. There are a lot of people who I put a lot of credence in over my adult Christian life, and their behaviors over the last couple of years, the last 3 or 4 years on social media has led me to believe that they have just completely lost it. And I'm like, I can't take anything you say serious anymore. I have to guard the knowledge that I have and the understanding of that knowledge that I have, so that I don't slip into believing those lies as well.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to do on social media. I mean, friendships or connections or follows, whatever you want to call it, depending on which platform, those aren't your real relationships. I mean, it's a kind of a relationship, but the real relationships are the people that you interact with, that you see face to face, or that you can call and talk to on the phone. And whether you are following or connected with those people online isn't really relevant to the relationship itself. And you can, I unfollow people all the time. There are certain topics that if I see somebody going on about it all the time, I'll just mute them, because it makes me angry, or it makes me disappointed in that person or think badly about them. So I just mute it. And it's probably better for our friendship if maybe we're not friends on Facebook sometimes.
I do that to family all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because I love them. I love them too much to listen to what they have to say. Genesis chapter 3. When we're talking about this, your keep discretion, your lips guard knowledge, and talking about our words and how we get in trouble with that, I couldn't help thinking about how the serpent says to the woman, "Did God really say you're not to eat from any tree in the garden?" And the woman answered. What would that story have been like had she not engaged? I mean, obviously this is the story of mankind, but the point of it is that when the enemy or someone who is an enemy to our soul, to our spiritual well-being, tries to engage us, we don't have to answer. In that context, he wasn't asking her, please, lead me to the Lord. He wasn't asking her, please instruct me in the ways of Yahweh. He was testing the word of God. And she answered him. She did not guard the knowledge that she had. She lacked the discretion, the understanding, and ultimately the wisdom to abstain from that whole thing.
Yeah, whether Adam failed to, communicate God's words accurately, or she failed to remember it, or whatever it was, she had access to what God actually said. So when the serpent said, "Did God really say that?" she had a way to verify it. And she just didn't. Crystal, was there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, awesome that you went back to the tree, because when I was looking up the lips keep knowledge and the boundary of thoughts and guard, the gnats and the branch came up when I was looking into that. So that's really cool that it went back to the tree. And I was thinking about even when we're walking with other believers, and how some things are just between us and him. And, depending on where they are in their walk, etc., some of these things, and me and another sister were talking about this the other day, about not wanting them to stumble, depending on what people are on their path. And some things are really just meant between us and him. No, there was no question. I was just saying, when she went back to the tree, and when you look up the words, the lips keep knowledge, the boundary to your thoughts, under guard, gnats came up, the branch. So I thought it was cool when she went back to the tree. But I was also thinking discretion with our knowledge. Some things are just between us and him. And I was wondering, because I was having issues with 16 and 17 and letting them be your own, and being out in the streets, and I'm wondering if those tie together. Okay.
I think what Crystal was trying to say, because we've had this conversation, is, and may I, Crystal, speak?
Yes.
Okay. Is that when you should keep some of that alone, is some of the communication you have between you and Yahweh is really not meant to be shared, especially with maybe those who are like maybe newer in the walk. And if you shared them, it'd be like casting your pearls among pigs type thing, where they couldn't receive it, or it could cause them to stumble. So what she was saying is, let it be to you alone is, maybe you shouldn't always share everything that Yahweh shows you to others. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Isn't that kind of what you were saying, Crystal? Did I interpret that right? Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Randy and Crystal. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, we have to be a little bit careful with that, because we don't want to get into the idea of secret knowledge, and that you have to be an initiate at the right level to know certain things. But there are things that not everybody is ready to hear. And you have to introduce people to things slowly. I mean, like in the whole debate in Acts 15, when the apostles were, bringing in all these Gentiles who didn't know Jewish traditions, and a lot of the Jews were saying, "Oh no, we can't accept these people. They got to go through all this conversion and be circumcised and learn all of our rules before they can come into fellowship." And Peter and James step up and say, no, we'll just start them with these simple rules, and that's fine for now. And they can learn as they go. And I think there is a lot of truth to that. And the idea
but don't you
that
think also that some things you don't need to share? It's just between you and Yahweh. That maybe you don't need to share it with others, or maybe that one-on-one, someone you're real close to only. But
yeah,
really
probably, especially, things that apply to your own personal life, especially, if God gives you guidance about a relationship or about something you're supposed to do, there may or may not be a reason to share that with other people. And it may be best sometimes just to keep that to yourself. There was something else that I was thinking. Here it is in verse 9. A man gets involved with this adulterous woman, and Solomon is saying, stay away from her, and lest you give your honor to others and your years to the merciless. And, the immediate context is that if you get involved with this other woman, you're putting your life at risk, because the penalty for adultery is death. But you can also destroy your household. You can destroy hers. You can cause all kinds of havoc in your life. It can cause you financial problems and, this cascade of bad events that just go on and on. And one of the reasons, just one of the many reasons for that, is that going all the way back to Genesis 2, Genesis 2:18. Then Yahweh God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. From the King James, the classic term there is the helpmeet. And people get totally the wrong idea about this word helpmeet, that, this is the Stepford wife, or, the subservient, whatever word you want to use. And not making any comment about egalitarianism versus, complementarianism or anything like that. The idea of a helpmeet, is a helper fit for him, someone who is like him. And I really like the way that the scriptures puts that when it says, I'm going to make a helper for him as his counterpart. In the word meet means opposite him, the Hebrew word. And counterpart is a really good way to express that in English, because it means somebody opposite his face, someone that he can look at that's like him. But when you get involved with a woman who is some other man's wife, or you get involved with a man who is not your husband, then you are turning that on its head. The word can mean somebody opposed to you, or it can mean somebody who is like you. And you're turning it around to the opposite meaning. Instead of the counterpart, the helper that's fit for him, now she's become the helper who is opposed to him. And it makes marriage exactly the opposite of what it's supposed to be.
Just real quick, Jay, I found first mention of the word wormwood.
Uh-huh.
And it's in Deuteronomy. Where am I? Deuteronomy 29, verse 18. And wormwood means regarded as poisonous, therefore accursed. Hemlock, wormwood, but first mention of wormwood is in Deuteronomy 29:18. Just
okay.
FYI.
Yeah, where the ESV has the poisonous.
Right. King James and the ISR both say wormwood. So I just found that interesting.
Is that the same word used in Proverbs?
I think so. Let me double check.
Bitterness. Proverbs 5:4.
Yeah.
Better end is bitter as wormwood.
So it's a curse, hemlock, wormwood. So they always say something about the word when it's first mentioned in scripture. It kind of go and see what it looks like, what the definition is there. So that's just
the first mention of a word or an idea frequently sets the tone for it in later scriptures, because the people who were writing later scriptures had access to the earlier ones, so that's going to have an effect on how they think of that word.
Right. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. I knew it was in the Torah. I just didn't quite remember where. So.
Okay, thank you. 7 to 14. I mean, we've already kind of jumped around a little bit, and that's fine. Bring up whatever it is that's on your mind. But moving into 7 to 14, there's always a lot of repetition. Listen to me. Do not depart from the words of my mouth, which is an interesting counter to do not let my words, guard. Was it put up here? Your lips may guard knowledge. I think they're saying the same thing, but putting it from an opposite perspective. Do not depart from the words of my mouth. So let your lips guard knowledge, and the knowledge is mine. Let your lips guard my knowledge. Keep your way far from her and do not go near the door of her house. If you know yourself very well, you know that there are tendencies that you have, that there are things that are more appealing to you, or that will catch your eye easier than other things. And once you know that, it becomes important just to not even go near it. Like someone who is an alcoholic, it's better not to even touch alcohol, because they know that once you get to that, once you start, it's hard to stop. And for some people, they can't go to anywhere where alcohol is being served, because even the smell or the sights and sounds can trigger those memories or those desires. And how close to the woman's door that you can get is going to be different for each person, I think. And that's a very personal thing. I mean, there's no commandment in the scriptures that say don't go to another man's house if his wife is there. But common sense says that if another man's wife is home alone and you're a man, depending on the context, depending on your relationship between your families, maybe visit tomorrow instead of today.
Or maybe bring someone with you.
Yeah. And even if the temptation isn't there for you, if you're going into a situation that may appear to be compromising, you should bring someone with you or try to avoid it, because if you're alone and you're in a position that appears compromising to other people, it's going to be easy for those people to misinterpret what's happening and cause them to stumble, or cause them to start talking about you, which could cause all kinds of people to stumble. But if you have somebody else there with you, at least you can say, someone can come to your defense as a witness and say, no, nothing was going on there.
Right. We've had a standing rule. We've been in, for our entire marriage, we've had some sort of involvement in church ministry or congregational ministry. And we've just from the very beginning always had a rule. And it was one that my dad and my mom had. They were in ministry as well, that you just never have an alone meeting with anyone of the opposite sex. In fact, you try to have limit one-on-one meetings to absolutely necessary, even with the same, because you want to, keep things as above board and have as much integrity for everyone, to protect them, to protect yourself, but especially with, members of the opposite sex. And I remember in first 10, 15 years of our marriage and the different fellowships we were part of, there was definitely some pushback on that. I would be involved in worship ministries, other things, and leadership, men in leadership. Well, we got to have coffee and we've got to do this. And I want to come in, and I'd be like, no, I can't do that. Or even there was, one pastor that would just show up at my house because he had something he wanted to talk about. And I was like, I'm sorry, you can't come in. And it was shocking to me because it was so different from how I'd been raised. And also, that this was a boundary that my husband and I had established, and that there was still the pushback. And not that I felt like I was being wildly pursued because I was, so tempting, but it was not a safeguard that was at that point, about 15 years ago, that wasn't as consistently or as powerfully addressed, I guess, as it is now. And I think we've seen in the last 15, 20 years, we've seen the results of that. Michelle was talking about that, the corruption, the sexual sin, the failures that we've seen. I think some of that has happened because those boundaries were we're all adults here. We can do whatever. We're all going to behave. And that sense of entitlement to another person's space or their time, regardless of who they are and their marital status.
Yeah. I think this might have come up last week, but there's that pastor who was recently reprimanded because he was passing crude jokes apparently through text messages with some woman who's married to some other guy in the congregation, and he was put on administrative leave. The elders determined that there was no physical relationship or anything going on. It was just inappropriate conversations by text. But he lost a lot of honor in the congregation because of that. Even those communications like that, I mean, even apart from, in-person counseling or meetings, having those kinds of conversations where you feel like you can cross those boundaries with somebody of the opposite sex who's not your spouse, there's a lot of potential for problems there. I mean, there's no outright adultery going on, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a loss of honor and respect. And how can a pastor continue being a pastor if he doesn't have the respect of his congregation? This concept of honor, it says in verse 9, lest you give your honor to others. It's hard for Westerners, I think, to really understand what that means. How does your mistake give your honor to somebody else? Rico Cortez and Ryan White both have some good teachings on honor shame culture and how that's different from our Western culture. Paula and I were listening to one earlier today from Ryan White where he's describing the difference between traditional honor shame cultures and our Western guilt innocence culture, where as long as you're not guilty, you're fine. But that's not really the way it works in an honor shame culture. If you are in a compromising position or if you are embarrassed somehow, then you're losing honor. And honor is it's a relative currency, where if we've got paper money, I mean, we can print all the paper money we want, and well, the government certainly does, and that does devalue currency it devalues. Well, we've got inflation. I don't want to get into that. It's kind of going down the wrong path. But we don't think of something like honor as a limited supply. So honor is just something that you feel about somebody else. But in an honor shame culture, that's not exactly true. It's more like gold and silver, where there's a limited amount of it to go around. And if one person has more honor, that means somebody else has less honor. And that's because it's relative. And everybody's honor has value relative to the person next to them. So if you are caught in a compromising situation or you are causing damage to somebody else, you now have less honor in the eyes of the rest of the community, which makes everybody else's honor around you go up. I think we have a hard time, really comprehending how important that is in an honor shame culture. But that determines your livelihood. It determines your entire family's livelihood, your ability to do business and even to function in the community. If you have great honor, then you'll be invited to sit in the gate where you will be a judge, considered an elder in the city. If you don't have honor, well, your testimony in court isn't going to be respected, let alone being invited to be a judge. These things honor might be the most valuable currency of all in an honor shame culture. And just making a bad decision, it's like taking your gold and throwing it out into the streets for everybody else to have.
Well, and I think from God's perspective, his whole deal is to restore honor, his honor and ours, mm-hmm. to restore us from, a place of shame and from shaming him to that place of honor. And we don't, as a culture, because we don't see those kinds of things, we don't really understand a lot of times that that's part of his goal, is to restore that. And it is a big deal. But I think we do see examples of how this happens in the world around us, especially even in the Western world. I think we see it. I think we don't know how to identify it because we're not familiar with the concepts around mm-hmm. honor and shame in the culture, because we haven't lived within that context. So I think that's a really I think it's there. If you have eyes to see it, I think you will see it. It happens all the time. But we haven't placed a value on that other cultures have, because we haven't understood why it would be important.
Yeah, but I think it is an important idea to wrap your head around if you're really going to understand some of the stories in the relationships in Scripture.
Well, that leads me to the question of, since obviously, we don't live in a shame honor society. Although it is interesting that there is a lot of shame to go around, there's just very limited doses of honor. But that, how do we, probably a conversation for another time, but it prompts the question of how can we interpret Scripture in the context of character without modifying our lens that we see it through, with the understanding that it is honor, shame, that the thing about guilt and innocence is that you're either guilty and then of course you must be punished, or you're innocent and then there's no consequence. Where with shame and honor, it's a variable. I mean, there can be some shame and some honor still retained, or a lot of honor with a little. I mean, it's a. I don't know if that makes any sense. But even in Scripture, I have seen a tendency to skip over the honor things like it's some sort of Star Wars Jedi or medieval mumbo jumbo, instead of really understanding that it is the core of character and the drive for how you function within community, according to Scripture and God's.
Well, I think that's why you have to, when you're reading Scripture, you have to understand the context, the culture, who's speaking, who they're speaking to. All that you have to have a little bit of a knowledge of that to get the full understanding of Scripture. Sometimes, ask those questions.
Yeah, and the culture is very different from ours. I think it's hard to even imagine just how different that ancient Israelite culture was from what we have today.
It's a really interesting thing, because like in our culture, because we're like so focused on innocence and guilt, like shame is paraded. Like shame is just like this, like it's a higher value for whatever reason right now, where we are in the culture. Like parading your shame in front of the entire world is somehow like considered fantastic. I don't really know how else to put that, but it is just on display, and nobody seems to really understand what the implications of it are, I guess. And partly I think it's because we are so far as a culture from clearly seeing what a position of honor would be, when we're so far fallen away from God's standards, for lack of a better term. It's like, how would we even know what honor is? And so we can wallow in shame all day long because we don't even have a concept for what honor would even look like. And I kind of wonder if that's what's happening with our culture.
I think that it plays into the idea, how Solomon closed the book of Ecclesiastes, that, after all the things that I've said and done, fear God and keep his commandments is the whole duty of man. But you can't really understand what it means to fear God if you don't have some concept of the relationship between honor and shame and how that affects relationships. If you have the utmost respect for somebody, if they are the most honorable person in your universe, then you fear that person because they have the power of life and death over you. And it's not just that they have power, it's that they have legitimate authority that everybody recognizes because of their honor.
An example of honor and shame that we don't, the first time I read it, I didn't realize it, but in the Torah, where the command is that if you hang someone, you do not leave them overnight. You take them down. And in an honor and shame society, God and Yahweh in his mercy, actually that, because hanging overnight hung is a shameful thing for the family. And so by, the command of you take that body down before sundown is really showing loving kindness and stuff like that on the family. That's why he said you couldn't leave the body up. And that's an honor and shame thing back then, that it was shameful to leave the body up. And that's also why crucifixion of Yeshua is one of the reasons they brought the body down, from my understanding, before sunset.
Yeah. And
all that honor and shame.
And they were doing it, because it is a shame and it's a curse. But they were really more concerned about cursing their own festivities and their rituals.
True.
Whereas in reality, it's a curse because it's a shame on God by abusing his image that way. If you execute somebody and you hang them on a tree, you don't leave them out there overnight, because no matter how bad they were, they still bear the image of God, and you have to respect that.
Right.
In 2013, a book came out called The Culture of Honor. And I never read it, but I have some family members that did read it and got very excited about the idea of the culture of honor and applying it. And yet the expression of it was, they truly believed that honoring someone was all about the words you spoke over them and the things that you said to them. So it was all very sort of two-dimensional. And yet, because we don't live in an act that is based on honor, for someone just to come up and say, I'm going to say really nice things about you that may or may not be true. I mean, I'm not saying they were lying, but they were still very, very positive, very uplifting, whatever. But if it's not followed up by actual tangible manifestations of what that means. So if I honor someone, that isn't necessarily, I say nice things about them and then ignore them throughout the rest of the month or the week or the whatever the time I have. When you live within my understanding, if you live in a culture of honor, it is that sort of status that indicates how you function, how you in court, whether or not you have a good testimony, your reputation, how your children are viewed, how your wife is perceived or your husband is perceived. It ripples out to your extended family, to your spiritual community. I mean, it's so integral to every aspect of your life that it seemed like the idea that my family members gleaned from this book was that now we just have to make really strongly affirming statements to everyone we know, whether or not there's anything other than words. And it turned out to be, what happened with that, at least in my relationship with them, is that they became untrustworthy because it was just words. And that may be my own particular bent, but it wasn't a holistic expression. And so it didn't feel like honor. It felt like flattery. Yeah,
that's an attempt at honor in a culture that doesn't understand honor and shame. If you speak honorable words to somebody, like you're trying to give them honor just by praising them, and then you turn around and act as if your words aren't true, you're actually shaming them, because you're treating them as if they're too stupid to know that you're lying to them. And everybody who heard the words and sees the actions is going to know that, and know that you don't really respect the person that you just said that you respected.
This somewhat makes me think about was it Noah and his sons? Who was it when they covered him, when they went backward into the tent? And
that was
what am I thinking
Noah.
About?
Yeah, that's Noah.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. It was like Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Ham shamed his father, and
yes.
Shem and Japheth were the ones who went backwards into the tent.
Yeah, and I think whether that is actually what happened or if it's an illustration of like what that looks like, to me that's an example of the two opposing ways of handling things. Though whatever happened there was not going to be known by anyone else unless it was made known, right? Mm-hmm. And so for the two brothers that went backward into the tent, they didn't have to go backward into the tent. They could have gone forward, covered him, whatever they wanted to do. But instead, that was kind of an example of discretion. Like they kept their eyes from seeing those things so that they didn't make anything out of those things for themselves, so that they weren't tempted. Mm-hmm. And they covered that shame so they could their father could retain his honor. Yeah. And it's just two different ways of being, I think, that are exemplified in that particular story. And that's real honor versus shame kind of behavior, where the rubber meets the road versus like just words. Mm-hmm. That's like really hardcore action to preserve honor and to avoid shame.
Yeah. I realize that we're kind of getting pretty far off track from the text of Proverbs 5, but I'm fine with that because it's an interesting conversation and it's all scripture based. So that's fine. But that reminded me of the coronation of Solomon, and I can't remember his brother that was competing with him, whether it was Absalom or whichever brother it was who declared himself king. And, he paraded through the city with trumpeters and, had a troop of 50 men running in front of his chariot. And he was trying to honor himself. He was declaring his honor. And whether or not he actually got to keep that honor depended on other people recognizing it. And if nobody had challenged him, he would have been keeping that honor. But instead, David brought in, Nathan and the priest and said, okay, everybody, Solomon is the king. Now take out 50 men to run before his chariot and take out some trumpeters and go all over the city, blowing the trumpets and pronouncing Solomon is the new king. Long live the king. And by doing this, by the current king, David, giving honor to Solomon, and by the high priest and the prophet recognizing this, not only did they legitimize Solomon and give him honor that nobody else could deny, they also made Solomon's brother have even less honor than when he started, because they publicly repudiated the honor that he was putting on himself. And it reminds me of it because Ham tried to shame his father. Essentially he's trying to usurp his father's place by pulling honor away from his father and leaving shame behind. But his brothers repudiated this and went in backwards and tried to restore honor to their father. And in doing so, brought shame on Ham, which brought a curse as soon as Noah found out what happened.
This reminds me of like when stuff like this happens, especially gossip or any of those kind of things, when people stand up to that, when people actually instead of participating, try to cover the shame of the person maybe being talked about or whatever. It's like it does bring shame on the person who was talking. It automatically points out that flaw, that error mm-hmm. that they've made.
I was going to say, kind of back to the text, there was several points where I couldn't read it without David coming to mind. Mm-hmm. And just thinking about, I guess, biblically or in the Bible, the epic scale of his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba, and obviously the shame, losing honor, and everything that went along with that. And I think about redemption in the midst of that for him, when he was confronted with his sin, that he repented immediately, and I'm sure sought forgiveness in whatever ways that he could. He humbled himself before the Lord, and I believe that from that moment on, that he began to, in a sense, rebuild his honor. But then thinking about, and this came to mind earlier, Paula, when you mentioned, that basically we have shame on parade in our nation at this point, mm-hmm. In so many ways. And then thinking about Absalom, they set up a tent on a roof and he went in to have relations with one of David's concubines. And it was just so arrogant and out there for everybody to see. And I think maybe he thought somehow he was doing a positive thing, but it was pride, and it was epic. But I see that even though David did rebuild honor, that at the same time there were consequences that played out in his life, the things that he experienced from then on, as well as in his kids. So, but redemption, is always possible as long as there's still breath,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got Absalom and Adonijah mixed up earlier. It was the other son, Adonijah, who later declared himself king instead of Solomon.
Right.
That David also had a great response. When Nathan confronted him about the adultery with Bathsheba, David didn't try to defend himself. He didn't try to restore his own honor. He immediately repented and, sackcloth and ashes, at least virtually. He humbled himself. And by openly admitting his fault and humbling himself publicly, he actually brought honor to himself. Whereas if he had defied the prophet and denied any wrongdoing, maybe he would have gained some temporary honor there in the court, but he would have lost a whole lot of honor. Through history, we would not be remembering David so fondly today. The next section is 15 through 20. I know it's after 8. So if we're going too late for everybody, then we can always call it quits. Just let me know if it's becoming a problem if we're going too late. Verse 15 to 20 is kind of the solution to the earlier problems. If you know you're tempted, stay away from this strange woman's door. Don't even go near her. If you go near her, if you listen to her words, you're going to get into all these problems. Well, here's the solution. It's a lot like what Paul said to the Corinthians. If it's better in our current situation, under persecution, it's better to remain single. But if you've got a problem with lust, go get married. Go, find a wife. And that it's not only part of God's primary design for mankind. Men and women are designed to be married and have children. But it also helps keep you honest. If a man has his own wife, if a woman has her own husband, and if they are trying to do what's honorable and right, then they're going to be less opportunities for temptation. And when the temptation does come, they're going to be less susceptible to it. It doesn't mean that everybody's infallible. Obviously with our, divorce rates, and every marriage has problems. Nobody's perfect. So there will always be temptations, but the primary solution that God has provided to avoiding complicated situations with the opposite sex is marriage.
And Jay, could you take this on a deeper level, i.e., knowing your king, your future husband, as the bride? In other words, knowing Yeshua as our king, as Israel being the future bride. You want to stay in him. You want to stay Yah-centric. Therefore you don't wander. You don't stray to the other false teachers and the tickling of the ears and all that. Because if you stay in him, you're not going to hopefully wander to the Babylonian horror or the false prophets or whatever. So it could even be a deeper level than just on the surface.
Yeah, and there are all kinds of opportunities for unfaithfulness there. God gave some very specific instructions to Israel, and a lot of ambiguous instructions too. But He did say, "Don't go to the pagan nations and learn the way that they worship their gods, and then come and try to do that with me." Like, God has told us how He wants to be worshipped, and it's not like those other people do it. But in the modern world, especially when we have instant communications with everybody in the entire world, and we have more access to historical information than has ever existed. I mean, we know more about the Hittite Empire today than the Greeks did, who only lived a few hundred years after the Hittite Empire died. And so we've got access to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and we've got the Bhagavad Gita, or the Rig Veda. Bhagavad Gita is a book written later, I think. We've got access to all of these pagan writings and religions. And for whatever reason, they are really tempting to a lot of people. Everybody wants to go and find out, what did these ancient people do? What did these ancient people do? Maybe they were onto something. We should incorporate a little of that into our own stuff. But God said, no, it doesn't matter how valuable or how effective we think that those rituals might have been. We don't go to pagans and learn how they worship their gods so that we can worship our God better. Doesn't matter how much we admire it.
Exactly. The syncretism and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
He says no.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean that everything that pagans did is bad. I mean, we can learn a lot from pagans, practical stuff, as long as it's not religion and worshiping their gods and trying to do that with our God. Right. And, it just depends on what it is. And does it fit in with God's commandments and his way of living? As long as it doesn't violate it, then it's probably fine. Probably.
I see.
Says Jay.
Oh, go ahead.
I said, thus says Jay.
Going back to what we were talking about at the beginning about the false teachers. Obviously the obvious one, stay with your wife, but it speaks of loyalty and faithfulness to that which you've committed yourself to, and that which is you're loyal, you have that integrity. And so, when it's talking about drinking water from your own cistern, being focused, being devoted, being dedicated, Randy's talking about loving our love that we have for Yeshua and our following of Yahweh. And that, and I think it was Randy earlier that had said something about, the things that sometimes the Father speaks to us, things that are for us and not for everyone else. This kind of has some of that connotation to it, is that maintaining that initial first love. In Revelation, it says, this I have against you, to this church. You've left your first love. You've lost your first love. They're no longer satisfied with what I've given you in the relationship that we have. And I think that in that context, this is a really stern warning in our relationship with the Lord to maintain our focus on him, to not be enticed by the teachings and the mystical things that seem really sexy and really exciting and really interesting. And that would keep us, but that would take us away from that focus of who our love is and who our loyalty belongs to.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I think in terms of like a human relationship, marriage relationship, there's all kinds of ways, that somebody could get bored or tired or whatever it is of their spouse's behavior that maybe they once thought was fantastic. And if we look at it through the lens of like our human experience and interpret God and our relationship with God through that, we could go very wrong, because what God does for us, what he has provided for us from the get-go, is better than and more than we could ever ask or imagine, right? Like if he had only, it would have been enough. And so the place where I think we usually go wrong, obviously, is when we start looking at other things besides him and his sufficiency. And we start thinking there's more to layer on top of that. Like it's God plus, it's Jesus plus, it's, and I don't mean like only Jesus. I'm not trying to say like the answer to every question is Jesus and you just spout that out to people and it's that simple. Life is complex and, it's not quite that way. But I do think that if we're focused on just like in our human relationships, if we're focused on the sufficiency of our partner, we're going to try to solve problems within the context of that relationship instead of looking outside of it, because we know that that's the thing we're committed to. But once we start thinking there's got to be more, and the world is ready to tell us that, we're kind of like already in trouble.
Well, and I think on a really practical level too. I mean, just reading the plain text, it's like, hey, dudes, hey, women, be satisfied with the spouse that you have. Is that, it's easy for us to think, well, it's never been easier to be tempted than it has been now. I mean, porn's free and you can find it anywhere, right? Mm-hmm. And that with this availability and people dressing modestly, and I was thinking like, man, it's just a really hard season. And then I thought, well, it's not like we don't, temple prostitutes and all that kind of stuff. I mean, the ancient world was also, if there were no prostitutes in town, there would have been no need to warn everybody about them.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Exactly.
If there weren't women who were willing to prostitute themselves or to be adulterers, or men that were willing to commit adultery, then there would have been no need to warn them about that. So this is obviously something that has been, it's a temptation that is common to mankind, but it's a choice. It's that inherent choice that you have, whether you're a single person or a married person, a young person or an old person, where you make a choice to be satisfied. I will tell my soul to be still, to rejoice in the Lord. Because what he has given me today, while it may feel emotionally inadequate, it is what he has given me and it is enough, and I will rejoice and be glad in it. Right. And it's that consistent choice of not saying this is what I'm entitled to and so I deserve it, but this is what God has given me and I am thankful and I'm going to walk in gratitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not just the choice to feel satisfied with what you've got, but to do what's necessary to be satisfied with what you have. Because there are choices in actions that you can take to make sure that what you have is working for you. And that's, anybody who's been married for more than a few months, I'm sure must be aware of that there are choices that you can make to make sure that your marriage is more satisfying for both of you. You're not even speaking just sexually, but, for the whole relationship. And there are choices that you can make to make sure that it doesn't work for you. And that is a conscious decision to do the work necessary to make sure that it's going to be a satisfying relationship and it's going to fulfill the purpose for which God instituted it.